Hi guys, welcome back to the Adaptive Zone podcast. My name is Matthew Boyd. I'm a physiotherapist and running coach. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're so inclined, share it with a friend. Today we're going to be talking about tapering for races in particular. And we've brought one of the two hosts of the Stronger Stride podcast. It's Sophie Lane.
Correct, yes.
Second name is correct, yeah. Who is joining us on the show today. Stronger Stride is a great podcast I've been listening to a little while. So I'll put a link in the show notes for you guys to check out. But Sophie, welcome to the Adaptive Zone podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so exciting to be here. And thank you for listening to our show. We both love your show as well. So it's really cool to be able to connect and be able to share an episode as well. So yeah, thank you for having me on. I'm excited to talk about tapering as well. And I guess for a bit of background for those who haven't listened to the show or aren't familiar with myself and Lydia, I'm an exercise physiologist by background. I'm spending a bit more time doing running coaching and strength coaching at the moment. I started off, I guess, post-uni doing a little bit more clinical work, a bit more rehab with injuries, but now spending a bit more time focusing more on the performance side of things, a little bit more in the coaching realm, starting anywhere from a complete beginner who can't run a kilometre all the way up to kind of more experienced ultramarathon runners completing multi-day events and that kind of thing. So yeah, pretty involved in the running community in Australia. And yeah, if I'm not running, I'm probably talking about running in some way.
Cool. Well, the show that sort of led me to reach out was an episode that you did about tapering, which I really enjoyed. And I kind of thought what would be cool is to set this episode as a complement to that. So what I'll do for the listeners, I'll put a link in the show notes to that specific episode of the Stronger Stride podcast. And you can listen to that one alongside. So that one's going to be more like, there was quite a lot of dense theory in that. And it was really interesting about tapering. And what I thought might be cool to do today is to use a case study of where you've sort of implemented some of those theoretical concepts to help sort of walk people through how it might look for them in real life when they're planning their own taper.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's a really good approach as well, because it's all good and well to have the theory and the research and the science, but that doesn't always look exactly how it's meant to be on paper. And obviously people are so different and so many different things can come up in life, different variables, personal circumstances. So you might have the perfect taper plan, but that doesn't always go exactly how you'd like it to. So I think it's nice to be able to see that in a real life situation as well.
Absolutely. So let's start with a bit of theory first, though, just to get a bit of background about what we're talking about here. So what is tapering?
Yeah, great question. So for those that don't know, if you're training for an event, it's kind of assumed that you will be increasing your training load throughout that 12, 16-week period, whatever it is. And just prior to the race, it's really important that we have a reduction in training load. So that's all we're talking about here. Tapering is just a reduction in training load. Now, when we speak about training load, there's kind of three main components of that. So that would be frequency. So how many training sessions, how many runs are you doing per week? Can we reduce that for the taper? Talking a little bit more about volume or duration, or how many kilometers are you doing or miles per week? And then the intensity. So how hard is the effort that you're putting in? And do we need to reduce that as well? So it's kind of those three main components. When we're tapering, we can kind of, depending on which method we go through, we reduce maybe one or all of these variables to then prepare ourselves for our event. So by doing this, we're reducing that accumulative fatigue. So we would have built up a lot of fatigue throughout our training block. We want to make sure that we are primed and ready to go and not feeling heavy in the legs and sore. You would know when you've had a big session, it might take you a couple of days to recover. So we want to make sure that we are as fresh and ready to go as we can be on race day. So simply just reducing those training variables is how we do that.
Okay, so you're essentially tapering off, like you're reducing your training intensity and volume before the race. And we're going to talk about specifically what that looks like. But from a physiological standpoint, like what are the benefits of that? Why do people do this?
Yeah, good question. And there's a kind of a number of different benefits. I guess a lot of our bodily systems have an influence on how we feel on race day, and there's a lot going on physiologically that we're probably not aware of. I think from an anecdotal point of view, we want to feel like our legs feel fresh, but what does that actually mean? So I guess we're thinking about our metabolic, neuromuscular, hormonal systems and what their kind of responses are to training. So a lot of the time we are putting a lot of stress through our body when we're going through training. So a lot of these systems are also absorbing a lot of that stress. So making sure that they're functioning optimally. So what tends to happen as we go through this tapering process, we see an increase in blood volume. And we also see an increase in mitochondrial respiratory function. We don't need to understand that in too much depth, but what's happening is there's some changes going on within our blood system and within our ability to utilize oxygen. So those two things, the blood volume and the mitochondrial function, help to improve our ability to carry and transport oxygen. And if we can do those two things better, we then end up with better utilization rates, so we can use the oxygen more effectively and therefore have improved endurance performance. So we know that to perform well in an endurance event, a long distance event, we need to use oxygen to help produce our energy and our fuel. So if we can do that process better, we're going to have better performance. And by tapering, we enable that process to work more efficiently.
So as if we were an engine, it's almost like we're increasing the efficiency of that engine by this mechanism, by tapering. It makes that engine more efficient so it can take the fuel it has and go further forward or faster.
Yeah, 100%. So that's kind of the majority of what's happening. And then there's a couple of other things as well in terms of our actual muscle fatigue. So we're reducing the fatigue in our muscles so they can contract a little bit more effectively and work a bit more easily. We also potentially have a little bit better ability to utilize the glycogen in our muscle cells as well. So we can kind of replenish those stores. When we're exercising a lot, we are constantly needing glucose or glycogen or whatever fuel source we're using. So we're taking that out of the muscle cells usually. When we taper and rest, those cells can be kind of more fulfilled, or we can increase our levels of glycogen in those stores. So then when we are racing, we've got more ability to utilize that fuel as well. So there's a number of different things going on, not just the difference in the oxygen ability.
So your body's kind of, if you were in an engine, your body's kind of tuning up the engine so it works efficiently, but also it's filling up the gas tank. That's your glycogen stores. It's going to fill you up with fuel and make sure that you have, well, as much as you could have come race day.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Okay, cool. So we're going to talk about, like I said, going through a kind of case study. So this is a specific runner that you had in mind that has done the race now, but I asked you to provide an example of how you would taper someone. So this is an athlete of yours. So could you tell us like a little bit about her, like sort of age and running experience and that kind of stuff, and what race she's tapering for?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've spoken to her about this, so she's happy to be named on the podcast. So Michaela, she's early 20s female. She's relatively new to running. So I only started running about middle August last year. So, coming up towards 18 months now, roughly. She's always been active, has been a netball player. So in terms of sporting history and sporting age, she's been an athlete for quite a while, but just never really specific into the endurance running until last year. She's had a bit of chronic history with some knee injuries. So she's had a couple of surgeries on her knees. She was sort of one of those people who was probably advised by the surgeon to not really get into running in order to prevent further damage, that kind of narrative. But she really enjoys running and really wanted to get into it. And we've been able to do that quite successfully. So last year she trained for a 30K, kind of did that on her own. We did a couple of sessions together. And then since then she's doing a bit of hybrid training, doing a bit of gym work and doing some running here and there, and wanted to redo the 30K again this year and improve her time. So we spent kind of probably a 12-week block focusing on building up to that. Now, as I said before, people are so individual. So her situation is totally different to every other runner there is. So we had to be really mindful of her injury history and making sure not to flare things up and have an increase in pain there. And we had to understand what her training age was and her ability to, I guess, absorb the training load that we're putting her through. So someone who had been training for 10 years, probably going to look totally different in terms of not only their actual training block, but also their tapering. So her taper is totally different to someone else in that situation. In terms of what the training looked like, I guess we're kind of averaging 25 to 50 Ks per week, which is such a broad range, but we had a few kind of personal work changes going on. She moved out to rural Australia, middle of nowhere, halfway through the training block. That was a 2-day drive back and forth. So on those weekends, we couldn't do our long run. So there was a few different things that came up, which you as a listener will know that things happen, things change that you can't prepare for, or even if you can prepare for, you kind of have to modify that training around. So yeah, our training was pretty good. She was consistent. She was keen. We did a lot of gym work as well. And then, we can chat about the taper soon. But yeah, the 30K was what she was training for.
Okay, so you've got an athlete who is relatively new to running, but is quite experienced in terms of she's just always been a sporty person,
Mm.
but she's training for a 30K. And it sounds like the training overall went pretty well, but perhaps not, some weeks were a little lighter than you would have liked because of other life circumstances. And that's the kind of situation with the context that you're planning this taper from.
Yeah, 100%. So I think this is the thing as well. When you are planning out a training block, I think it would make more sense or be, I guess, easier to just go, okay, this is what the 16 weeks is going to look like. Here you go and do it. But you just have to be so much more adaptable than that. And even, we might have had at the start of the training block had a plan of what the taper might look like, but that is going to vary so much. And when you dive into the research a little bit or listen to the other episode, you'll understand how varied the taper needs to be based on those individual characteristics, and particularly that acute to chronic training load. So what have they done over the last 5-10 years versus what have they done in the last 12 weeks? And if they're really well adapted and they've had more experience, they might not need such an aggressive taper because they're used to having that amount of volume and their body's more adapted. If they're a little bit newer, you probably have to be a bit more aggressive with that taper to make sure that they're feeling fresh and having those benefits we spoke about earlier.
Okay, so younger training age, less fitness, lower level, you're thinking a little bit more aggressive with the taper, and then higher level athlete, longer training age, you're thinking you don't need to be quite so aggressive with the taper often.
Yeah, I think so. I think partly that would be psychologically as well. I think newer runners might have a higher perception of fatigue or muscle soreness, and they might feel as though if they had done 3 or 4 training runs in the week of their race, that they're going to be too sore, too fatigued, and then that's going to impact their race. Whereas someone who is used to running 6 or 7 days a week, high mileage for years, might go the complete opposite and think, oh, if I don't run at all this week, or if I only do 1 or 2 runs, then I'm going to lose fitness, or I'm going to be all stiff and sore. And so I think you've got to be mindful of their psychological perception as well as the physiology. You need to understand that their confidence leading into race day is so influential on how the actual event goes. If they're feeling like, yes, I've done the right thing for me, and I feel fresh, or I feel ready, or I've done enough, or I haven't done too much, then they're going to do so much better than if they're either thinking they've done too much or not enough.
Yeah, because tapering can be a psychological battle. We'll maybe touch on that a little bit later when we've been through the more practical elements. So let's say, I've forgotten her name. What was
Michaela.
the young lady's name? Michaela. So what are you planning with overall running volume during her taper?
Yeah, so I guess what we were kind of looking at is, or what the research suggests is, there's kind of 3 main ways to taper. So you've got just a complete step taper. So let's say that you're averaging 50 kilometers per week for your regular training block. You might then reduce your taper training volume to 20 kilometers per week for the last 2 weeks, and then you do your race. And that would just be a complete drop, and you just keep the same intensity, duration, volume for that taper. The other way to do it is
so it just looks like a step down.
Complete, yeah.
It's like you're on one level and you step down to a much lower level immediately. Okay,
exactly. Yeah. So pretty simple to do, but probably not the way that the research is suggesting you should go about it. Then there's linear. So you might go from 60 kilometers to 40 kilometers to 20 kilometers and then do your race, for example. So you've got kind of more of a diagonal arrow down if you're looking at it on a graph. And then you've got
a slope, like a hill.
Yeah, exactly. Like a 45 degree. Yeah. Then the final one, which is probably more encouraged, is what we call the exponential. And then there's 2 options there. There's slow or fast decay. So when we're thinking exponential, if you know a graph, what we're thinking about is, let's say the graph is at the top left where we've got 60 kilometers. If we're doing the fast decay option, which is more encouraged, it'll have a really significant drop. So you might go from 60 kilometers to 20 kilometers, for example. And then that next week or the next 2 weeks, depending on how long your taper is, will still reduce a little bit, but it won't be such a significant drop. So you're having a really big initial decrease and then just tapering off a little bit from there. So that's sort of what seems to be the most commonly used or has the best results. Of course, there's so many variables, but that is kind of what we were thinking, is have a really nice big drop and then just a little bit less for the final week. And I think that kind of matches training load as well, and almost thinking about having that peak block of your training sort of reverse. So you're building up towards this big long run or big increase in volume maybe over a couple of weeks, and then you want to kind of reverse that almost, so you're dropping down and having a really nice taper. So we were sort of looking at her longest training on, we were planning to be about a 25k run, and then we were going to have a reduction in that volume there. So we went from, let me just bring up some numbers, I think we were aiming for about a 55 to 60k sort of peak week, and then we dropped down to 40ks for 2 weeks prior to the race, and then 20ks the week prior, and then we had race week, which was just an easy jog and a session. So basically we were trying to significantly drop that volume. And of course the numbers, you can get really caught up in the numbers and it can look really good on paper, but practically it might not work for their availability, what they can fit into their schedule, all those kind of things. So take the numbers with a grain of salt, but basically we needed to reduce that overall volume in those initial weeks. Yeah. Does that make sense?
So did you say you went from about 60k to like 40 and then 40 and then 20 kind of thing? So it was that big drop and then a slightly slower drop. So the big drop initially, that's that fast decay. And then you kind of kept it steady at around from 40 to 20 and into the race. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's about it. Yeah.
And this is as the research says currently, this way of doing it's probably the best.
That's
when you
what
compare
it seems.
to like So a linear one would be going, like if she was at 60k, it would be going over a period of weeks, 50, 40, 30, 20, and into race.
Yep.
And then a step would be just, from 60 to 20 or 10 immediately, and then stay there for 3 or 4 weeks. So
yeah, for sure.
Whereas yours is a bit more of a drop. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And I think something to think about as well is your actual duration for the taper. That can be quite important, and that will determine what the taper actually looks like as well. And as we were speaking about before, the difference between that more experienced to more novice runner, I would vary the duration based on that as well. So the guidelines sort of suggest anywhere from 8 to 14 days is a reasonable amount of time for a taper for a marathon, for example. So for someone who's a newer runner, I would stretch that out towards the 14-day. You could even go slightly longer if you wanted to. And for someone who's more experienced, I'd go more towards the 8-day, or you could think about it as a week. And of course, it's going to depend on their training history, but also what the race is. So is it an A race? Is it their sole focus of the year? Have they been working towards this for forever? Then you'd probably want to take a longer taper. If it's just a training race that they're doing as part of their usual program, you probably don't need to do that too much, because if you're someone who's super into events and you're doing races every month, you're going to end up with not being able to do that much training because you're constantly having that taper. So focusing on and planning your taper around the priority that this event is for you as well, I think is quite important. And for Michaela specifically, this was the big event of the year, so we really took that 2 weeks and probably even a little bit more than that to stretch out that taper and make sure she was feeling ready to go.
So for your A race, you could call it, you want a full taper done properly to maximize your performance. And then for B races and C races, you can use a little judgment, work with your coach, or sort of use your own judgment to decide how significant a taper to put in, bearing in mind that will cost you a bit of performance. But if you have, like you said, a bunch of races across the season that are like B races, and you tapered for each of them, overall your performance would suffer from just less training when it came to the A race, whenever that comes.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's something that we really need to focus on as runners is consistency. So if we are having these massive peaks and troughs with our training because we're doing so many races, it's really hard to build consistent month-on-month training. And of course it depends what you want. If you just love racing and just want to do all these events and have fun and be social and that kind of thing, go for it. But if you've got longer term goals and you've got something coming up in the next year or two that you want to focus on, then maybe cutting back a couple of races, or if you are going to do the races, having them more as training runs, as just kind of your long run throughout that training block, would probably be a better way to approach it, rather than having a big reduction in training to have that full taper each time.
Yeah, I like that term you use, training race. Like if you have a race that's not an A race, call it a training race. Look at it as a training run. You don't taper for training runs. Whereas if it's the big race that you've been training for the last few months, more seasoned athletes might have, depending on the distance as well, they might have, a bunch through the year. And like this, Michaela, it sounds like maybe just had one this year, but so that bit depends. But how important it is to you dictates how strict you are with the taper. So if it's really important, be very strict. If it's not that important, you don't have to be so strict with the taper.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Okay. So that's what you did with the overall volume. What about in terms of the long run? What did you do with that and why?
Yeah, great question. So, probably 5 or 6 weeks before the race, Mick came to me and said that she was keen to do a half marathon, which happened to be 3 weeks before the event. So this is where we start to think about: is this a training run or is this a race? What's the focus of this? For her, I think it was just kind of a social fun thing to do. It was down on the south coast in Australia, a beautiful place to be. So yeah, I was happy for her to do that. But what we had planned initially for that particular training run was going to be a 25K. That was going to be her peak training run 3 weeks out. But now she wanted to do the half marathon. So that was fine. We just needed to include a bit of a warm up, bit of a cool down, and we'd still hit that mileage. And we just had to be mindful of what she was getting out of that event. We've obviously had that history of the knee injuries. Very early this year, February, she did a 10K and had to pull out because of the knee pain. So we're just mindful that potentially, whether it's intensity that brings that on or is it just chance, we're not quite sure exactly what happens with that. So just being really mindful doing that half marathon, maybe not getting too caught up in the atmosphere and the crowd and pushing things too much. When you've spent all this time focusing on this one event, you don't want to then have to pull out 3 weeks out because of a issue that happens a few weeks before in a fun run. So yeah, we did that. That was the final long run. Then we dropped down to about 15Ks, and then the final long run before the event was 8Ks. So it was sort of like 3 weeks out was 25, and we went to 15, then 8 was the final weekend before, if that makes sense.
And why do you reduce the long run during the taper?
Yeah, great question. So when we're looking at this reduction in training load, the key thing that we need to be reducing is our volume. So the research suggests that volume, and then I guess frequency kind of comes along with that, is what we need to reduce when we're looking at the taper. So maintaining some intensity there. Now, of course, when we're looking at our overall training week, the long run takes up a big chunk of that training volume. So if we can cut the duration or distance of that, then we're going to be reducing our volume just naturally through that process. We still want to maintain some intensity though. So we want to make sure that, we'll talk about soon, our interval sessions or tempo runs or whatever we're doing for that, the intensity is still high for those, but we might be reducing the volume of those. So with our long run, we're gradually progressing that throughout the training block, and then we're cutting that volume down to ensure that we're fresh and ready to go and all those systems are functioning as we spoke about before.
Okay. And then you mentioned about intensity. So could you explain, maybe if runners who aren't familiar with what that might mean? Because I can imagine someone who hasn't done, is as familiar with the lingo thinking, well, a 30K run is very intense. So what do you mean by intensity, and what would you do with those other workouts during the taper period?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, I think, and it does get a bit confusing. I know when I recorded the first episode, there are a few questions around what does that actually mean with intensity. So when we're thinking about intensity, we're thinking about perceived exertion. So if you're running along and maybe you're doing a 30K run, for example, when you finish that 30K run, you'll think, oh, wow, that was really hard. But when you're in the moment doing the run, how hard was it out of 10? Could you have a conversation? Could you sing a song? If it's that kind of intensity, then it's probably a 2 or 3 out of 10. If it was so intense that you can't speak to the person next to you, couldn't say any words, you're completely gassed, working as hard as you could, then you're probably up around that 8 or 9 out of 10. So we can look at that rating of perceived exertion as a measure of our intensity. You could also use pace or heart rate or power, depending on how you measure that. But if we're talking really basic simplicity, RPE, so how hard was it out of 10? When we're speaking about intensity for a taper, we really want to make sure we're maintaining some intensity through that taper, but reducing the volume. So for example, if you were doing an interval session in your normal training block, which was 4 lots of 1K at an 8 out of 10 effort. So that was your big session, peak week. In our taper session the following week, we still want to maintain that intensity. So we still want to be working at 8 out of 10 intensity. We still want to have that same feeling of the same out of breathness that we had last time, the same exertion, let's say, but we're doing less distance. So we might, instead of doing our 4 by 1K, we might do 4 by 400 meters. So we're running for less time or less duration, less distance, but we're still working at that same intensity. Now the confusion then comes in with the intensity running a 400 meter versus a 1K. Our pace might be totally different because we can sustain a faster pace for 400 meters, which will feel similar. So all you want to be thinking about is that perceived exertion. How hard does this feel in the moment? Can I have a conversation? Can I not say any words at all? Think about where you sit on that scale. And when you're doing your intense sessions throughout your training block, we want to maintain that intensity during our taper, but we're just not doing it for as long. Does that make sense?
Okay. I think it does. I'm going to try and clarify, and you can tell me if I've got this right. So if we want to maintain intensity, then I think what you're saying is during the taper, we still want to have periods during some of our runs where we are breathing so hard we can't talk very well, because that's high intensity. And we want to maintain some of that during the taper, but we want to reduce the overall volume of running that we're doing, so the amount of minutes or kilometers or miles we're running in a week. So those sessions where we have those sprinkled parts of intense work, overall, those sessions are going to be shorter. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay. And why is it important to keep those periods of high intensity work during the taper?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it can be a little bit confusing, but I think anecdotally, people can probably relate. If you spend a week or 2 weeks just doing easy jogging and your intensity is quite low and you're just doing kind of slow, easy mileage, you then turn up to the race day and you probably don't feel like you've got that oomph, that feeling of ready to go, ready to race. It's also helpful for your pacing. So if you spend 2 weeks doing your taper and you're just jogging and then you turn up to the race day, you're not going to have as I guess you're not going to be as in tune with the pace that you're needing to be running at. So if you can still have some race pace efforts throughout the week, when you turn up to race day, you'll have that feeling of knowing exactly what that should feel like. So hopefully the common problem that we all have, everyone has it with going out to these events, is running out too fast. But if we've spent time during that taper period practicing, rehearsing what that race pace feels like, we should have a little bit more perception and understanding of what that feels like. So psychologically, it's quite helpful in that sense. We also see that the intensity doesn't have the same accumulative effect on those systems that we spoke about before. So you don't have that same fatigue and, I guess, damage to the muscle cells, those kind of things, from those shorter bursts of intensity versus the longer duration. So we want to kind of, as you said, sprinkle it in, have a little bit of intensity, and that can look like a different number of things. You might be doing some tempo runs or those 1K efforts in your training. Then we might work towards maybe just doing some 30 to 60-second efforts at your race pace. That can look like just some strides. So you could be doing your easy jog and then maybe 5 or 6 lots of 30 to 60-second efforts, or 200-meter efforts, that kind of distance, just to turn the legs over, get you feeling like, okay, this is what I feel like when I'm running fast. So psychologically, you feel as though you're still in it, and you know that when you turn up to race day, you're feeling good and you've still got that. Because I think there comes a lot of doubt when we're in this taper period. We feel like, oh, have we done enough? Am I fast enough? I don't think I'm going to be able to hit those times. And if you're just jogging, that's probably going to reinforce those thoughts. But if you're able to sprinkle in some of this intensity at race pace, you'll probably feel like, actually, no, this feels quite easy. I can do this for a minute or two and it's totally fine. So when you get to the race, you'll feel a little bit more confident.
Okay, cool. So if I could sum up, if we're going to taper, we're looking at 7 to 14 days. We want to take the total volume of running we're doing across the week. And in the first week or so of our taper, we want to drop it down quite a lot and then kind of level it out. That's that. I've forgotten the word you used.
Exponential fast decay. Yeah.
Yes. And then, so that's what we do with the volume. And a big part of that is going to be chopping the long run down quite a lot. But during the runs that we are still doing, we're going to keep some intensity in there, which means faster running at a harder perceived effort, at least for short, for periods of time. And we want to do some of that around race pace, because we don't want to go into the race having gone maybe 2 or 3 weeks sometimes without having run anywhere near our race pace, and then it just feels very foreign. It's not a very nice mental situation to go into a race in.
Yeah, 100%. I think the only other thing that we haven't touched on there is what to do with your strength training if you are someone who hopefully is doing some strength training during your training block.
They listen to this show, they will be. It's all I ever talk about.
They better be. Otherwise, tune out now. Yeah, so if you are doing a strength training, which you all should be doing, we also need to have a similar approach to our strength training taper that we do our running taper. So reducing that volume. So if you're doing 4 sets of 10 back squats at 20 kilos, let's say, you then want to still move the same weight or even slightly more weight potentially, as long as you're doing it within, something that you're able to achieve, but reducing that volume. So you might now do 4 sets of 5 instead of 4 sets of 10, but maintaining the intensity again. You also want to think about some other things that lead to that muscle soreness. So things that we in normal training really want to aim for, which is that full range of motion, maybe some slow eccentric, so that slow lowering phase, a lot of time under tension. All those things are really good when we are training and we're trying to build strength and capacity. But when we want to be fresh and feeling good, those things make our muscles feel a little bit sore, maybe a little bit fatigued. So you can think about potentially reducing your range of motion. So maybe squatting down to a box rather than squatting all the way down towards the floor. You can maybe move a little bit faster and have more of a power focus, so you're not moving the weight so slowly. That'll help you to feel a little bit fresher as well. And just focusing on reducing that training volume. So still getting your strength work in, still doing your calf raises, your squats, lunges, whatever you're normally doing, but reducing that volume down quite significantly as well.
That's an excellent point. I never thought to touch on that specifically, but it sounds like you just mirror the same things that you're doing with your running training in your strength training. Keep some intensity, reduce the volume, and then a couple of little tidbits there is not so much focus on the slow lowering or very slow movements. It's okay to move a little quicker during those workouts, just because we don't want to increase muscular soreness if not necessary.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. How did Michaela's race go?
Yeah, great question. Drum roll. Really, really good. So the event itself, for those who don't know, it's the Movember More Than a Run. So it's an event organized by some guys from here in Sydney, and it's all about mental health and community. And it's not necessarily a big race. There's no actual start line. There's just a finish line. So the actual concept of the event itself is totally different to anything else. So it was really about connecting community. We're all chatting, having a good time. So in terms of a typical race format, it's totally different. So it was really important for Michaela to get to a point where she could run the 30K comfortably enough so that she could still be engaged with the people we were running with. And she was quite involved in the organization of it all. So making sure that she got to the start line feeling confident that she could actually do the event, so that she could do it with everyone. She could feel fresh enough to be able to communicate with people and that kind of thing. So that all went fantastically well. It's summer here in Australia, so it was pretty warm on the day. It was only a couple of weeks ago. We had rain pretty much constantly, but it was quite humid and warm. A couple of hills in there as well. So it was definitely a tough day, but she did really, really well. Took a heap of time off of last year's time as well, and felt really strong, felt really good. And she's hoping to maybe do a marathon next year. So definitely inspired her to
Cool.
push the distances again. So yeah, it's exciting.
Excellent. And that brings it home nicely. I have a couple of common questions that I've heard from runners about tapering that I thought might be nice to just shoehorn in at the end, if that sounds good.
Yes, please. Sounds good.
So probably the most common one is, will they lose fitness during the taper?
It's a fantastic question. And I think if we look at it acutely, so if we look at one bout of tapering throughout the whole year, it's not going to have an effect. There's some studies to say that VO2 max is unchanged if you do 10 days of complete no training. So if you just sat down on the couch for 10 days, your VO2 max wouldn't have a significant change over that duration. So our tapering obviously isn't just us sitting down. And I think that's something as well. You're not just sitting down for 2 weeks straight. You're still moving. You're still doing similar things, just less of it. But we don't see that reduction in our fitness. The only thing I would consider, as we were speaking about before, is if you are one of those chronic racers who are just racing all the time, if you are having a proper taper each time, then overall, over the years and years of doing that, you're probably not going to experience the same level of fitness as you would have if you hadn't had so many tapers. But if you're just someone who's doing 1, 2, 3 major races throughout the year, it's not going to have an influence on that at all. And in fact, if you're well tapered, well rested, ready to go, you'll perform better on the day, and you'll probably have better adaptations physiologically from the race itself that will then lead into performance improvements and fitness improvements after the race, rather than going into the race, under tapered, and then not performing as well and then losing the benefits in that way.
Yeah, so you'll get more performance enhancement from the race itself if you're going properly tapered, just because you'll run faster. Okay. And a lot of people describe feeling like anxious or restless. Is that normal during the taper period?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, the psychological component is huge to this, and I think we've all been there, we've all experienced it. I think there's a lot of doubt that sets in, and you feel as though you've not done enough. I think it's so common to turn up to the race and just think, I didn't do enough, my long runs were too short, I haven't trained enough, I haven't done enough sessions, I haven't run fast enough, all those questions, and that's just totally normal. I think that just shows that we care and that we want to do well, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's not a fun feeling, it's not super comfortable, but I think making sure we approach our taper in the right way, still including some runs, not just completely stopping everything, including some intensity, still getting into the gym, practicing that race pace effort will probably make you feel a little bit more confident. And just knowing that you've done the work and you also can't change anything now. There's not another week of training the week before the race is not going to have an effect on your fitness or your outcome in the race. It'll probably make you perform worse because now you'll be fatigued.
Yeah.
So you can't change anything. So just live with that fact, take some deep breaths, get some hydration in, relax, and just enjoy the fact that you don't have to do so much. You can spend more time doing other things for those last couple of weeks. So try and enjoy it as much as you can, and just know that, yeah, you're not alone.
Yeah, the thing I always stress to my athletes when they ask about this is that, it's going to take you a couple of weeks to adapt to any stimulus anyway. So whatever you do now won't help your race. And that's one thing. And then the other thing is to kind of reframe the way you look at that nervousness, that anxiety, that the butterflies in your stomach, kind of the anxious thoughts, and look at that as you having done all this training. You're used to being tired, and now you're just full of energy, and it's almost kind of bursting out of you. And you're going to use that on race day, but you got to hang on to it until race day. And I think that way
Yeah.
of reframing the way you see it, then you don't so much see yourself as stressed and nervous. You see yourself can't wait to get going, like anxious energy kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, putting that energy to good use.
And is there any benefit to doing like cross training and stuff during the taper?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that I probably wouldn't add in if you haven't been doing it. If you're experienced with swimming or cycling, if you do those things regularly, then yeah, absolutely keep it up and just apply those same principles. So just reduce that volume that you're doing. But if you've never swum before, never ridden a bike, or never been on a cross trainer, I just don't know if it's worth trying. I don't know what you're going to gain from it. You might get a little bit of cardiovascular improvement long term if you keep it up, but if you're just doing it for those last 2 weeks before a race, I don't think it's going to give you much else, any benefits from it. So I probably just wouldn't bother. If you want to and you're doing it kind of comfortably and you've got no issues with it, and you've done it before, then yeah, go for it, but just still reducing that volume. I think don't get caught up in thinking that, oh, I'm doing less running, so now I can do all this cycling and swimming that I haven't had time for. And then you end up just still overloading the system just through a different way.
I think a lot of runners, particularly the more people who are more anxious, think, well, if I can't run, I'll do something else to kind of burn off this energy. And that's kind of the wrong attitude to have. Like, you want that energy. You don't want to be, training the same volume, just in different sports. You want to be training less volume so that your body can sort of charge up, rebuild, tune everything up, and be ready for race day.
Yeah, for sure. I think you've got to think about it in an energy sense rather than, I think people get really caught up in this idea that running is a high load sport. So if we're doing things that are low load, then we're giving our body less stimulus or stress. But it's all about energy in versus energy out. We're still requiring our body to produce energy. We're still depleting our glycogen stores, requiring our body to go undergo a stress. It just feels a little bit different to running.
Yep. Cool. All right. That's a lovely place to end. Thank you, Sophie. If people want to learn more from you, where could they go to find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably Instagram is the place that I'm most active on. So you can reach us at Stronger Stride. That is the podcast, or my personal page is at Sophie Lane. And then, yeah, we've got plenty of episodes for you to dive into at the Stronger Stride podcast on any podcast platform that you like. And yeah, we'll have to get you on the show next.
That sounds great. I'd love to. Like I said at the start, I'll put a link to that specific episode that you did on tapering, which I think it was nice compliment today, as I hoped it would be. This was very much like how to implement it, and that was like a kind of deeper dive into the physiology, which is always fun to nerd out on. So for the listeners, just click the link in the description. You'll get to that, and you can subscribe there. And Sophie, thank you for joining us.
No, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. It's been really fun.